Well, hey, good morning, everybody. Good to see all of you guys, and thank you so much for being here, and happy Easter. If you're new to this Hill City family, my name is John Wagler. I'm part of this team here, and grateful you decided to get real close with someone today. There's just nowhere else to sit or be, so this is just the way it is. You should have come to the 8 o'clock. How about that? This is a day of celebration, y'all. This is such a wonderful day, and there's so much to celebrate. And how many guys would love to see like our society change? Yeah, right? Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about that leading up to this weekend. And because here's what I know. Communal change happens through personal renewal. Okay, so if you want to see like society around us change, guess what has to change? Yes. Look at the person next to you and say, you do. Yeah. If they're really bad, say, you really do. Right? Like, yeah. It's like your fault, right? Like, so, but in order for that to happen, like we've got to have this personal renewal and change. You know, here's the beauty of Easter, and here's what one of the things that it signifies is this reality when Jesus' death and resurrection happens. It means all this evil, all the sorrow, all the sin, all the suffering, all the things that we see that we just wish weren't around, our only hope is in the reality of Jesus. And here's what's interesting about all of this. Historically, even non-religious historical writings talk about the reality that this Jesus person died. Okay, so if anyone's like, oh, Jesus never died, you wouldn't find a historian worth their weight in anything that hasn't at least agreed to that. Okay, so as just a simple historical fact, we do know that Jesus died. We do know that Jesus was here on this earth. We do know that Jesus had a grouping of followers, and so we know those things. Like that's a historical fact that's in non-religious writings and of course religious writings too. But something else happened. You see, what ended up soon after Jesus dies, it's, something happened. Like this huge movement happened. And what's interesting is a couple hundred years afterwards, when sociologists look at what happened to the Roman Empire, one of the key factors that they talk about in terms of upending the empire was the reality of this Christian movement. And so something happened, something significant happened through this resurrection of Jesus. So everyone in this room, you have to deal with this reality of Jesus, all right? So you have to deal with that he died, and then you have to make a decision, did he actually rise from the dead? That's the decision that you have to make today. Like you have to determine, because if that's true, it changes everything. It changes your whole entire life. It changes your outlook. It changes like your hope. It changes everything you can possibly imagine. If it's true. If it's not true, this was a mistake. You guys should have stayed at home. The Masters is on right now anyway. Like you should have just stayed at home, right? But if it's true, it literally changes everything. So when everyone raised their hands and wanted communal change and societal change and all that stuff, guess what? Our only hope is the reality of this message of Jesus. Because people are just being good on their own, guess what? That doesn't work. People are just kind of managing their own way. It doesn't work. We've tried it. We know it. You've probably tried it yourself. I know I've tried it myself. It doesn't work. There's something happened with this reality of Jesus. And so over the next several weeks, it's going to start today, we're going to talk about what happened to people when they encountered the risen Jesus and when they experienced him, what changed in their life and what changed around them. There's this guy named Simon who later became known as Simon Peter. He didn't necessarily change names per se. It was a description given to him. And so he becomes known as Simon Peter. So Peter means the rock. Okay, so when I say the rock, you probably think of this gentleman, right? So you probably like immediately think of that, right? Like that's what we think. What's interesting is when I think about Peter, this is how I've always pictured him. And I don't know what happened to me in Sunday school, like growing up or whatever, but I've always pictured Peter like this, like a little crazy hair, strong, but maybe let himself go a little bit. And so like this is just how I picture Peter for my whole entire life. And Peter was one of these, he's known as one of the fathers of the faith. Our Bibles are broken up into an Old and New Testament. The hinge point is Jesus. And then the first 4 books of the New Testament are the Gospels, which detail the life and teachings of Jesus. But then you kind of get into this church thing. This movement that started based off of the resurrection of Jesus. And then there's these letters that are written to some people that help them like understand what is it like to follow Jesus in context. And so Peter was one of those writers. Peter became known as this incredibly passionate, strong, bold, courageous person that followed Jesus with all that he had and eventually dies on a cross. He's like, I'm declaring the reality that Jesus is Lord, then he died and rose again, and eventually Peter dies in the same fashion, giving his life up for the reality of who Jesus is. And so that's Peter's legacy, that's Peter's reputation, that's Peter's life. But that's not all to Peter's story. What I want to do is I want to take through 5 just little vignettes of Peter's story here this morning. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to see maybe where you are in the story. And here's what I want you to wrestle with. Did this whole resurrection thing actually happen or not? Because when you leave today, you're going to have a choice with that. You can walk out of here just as you came in, and if you didn't believe, that's your call. You absolutely have a choice. I can't force you to do anything. I'm not going to try and scare you into anything. None of that. You have a choice on whether or not this whole Jesus thing is real. But if you decide it's real, it changes your life. It changes everything. You see, part of Peter's story is pretty interesting. He's known as one of the disciples, the closest followers of Jesus. But watch this. When Jesus rose again, these women came to the tomb looking for Jesus, and they encounter this angel. And it's dictated out in Mark 16. It says, "Don't be alarmed, this is the angel. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and who?" Can you guys read? Just want to make sure it's up there. Tell his disciples and who? Peter. Good job. "He is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Now here's what's interesting. I thought Peter was a disciple already. And it's fascinating in this part. Either Peter considered himself like separate from the disciples because he was helping Mark write the gospel, or the disciples didn't consider Peter a follower anymore. There was this separation that was happening. So even the angel was like, "Hey, go tell the disciples." And the woman would be like, "All right, we know who that is." And then the angel was like, "And Peter." So there's something. Now, Peter, well, hold on a second. Peter was this pillar of the Christian faith. Peter was the guy who wrote, 1st and 2nd Peter. Peter was this bold, courageous person that we see all throughout the New Testament. But he had this moment where he was distant from God. He had this moment of denial. He had this moment where he was actually maybe considered not following him. Maybe that's part of your story. And so I want to take you through these 5 vignettes, and here's the way that they're going to look. There's a calling, there's a stirring, there's a distance, there's a denial, there's a redemption. There's a calling, there's a stirring, there's a distance, there's a denial, there's a redemption. My hope is that all of us will see, in particular, the stirring and the redemptive part. That's where I've been praying for all you guys today, is the stirring and the redemptive part. But I want you to see the 5 vignettes and maybe see yourself in this story. So first, the calling. In Luke chapter 5, Simon answered, so they're out fishing, and they know Jesus a little bit at this point. And he's done some teachings, and they know of him, and they've been around him to some degree. So Simon, this is Simon Peter, answers, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled the boat so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." So we begin to see the passion in Peter right away. That there's something in him, that there's something that's just so, like he's gripped by the reality of the moment. For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken, and so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid, from now on you will fish for what?" So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and did what? Wow. So get this, in this calling that Peter has in this moment, it's really interesting, and there's this little subtle thing that Jesus is doing. He's like, you guys are fishing in the way you want to fish, in the way that you think that you're supposed to fish. And you think that that's going to fulfill you. You think you're going to catch what you need. You think you're going to have life through that, and that you'll be able to provide for yourself, but it's empty. He's like, so throw your nets on the other side, because that's where I'm telling you to throw your nets, and that's actually where you'll find everything. And so in this calling, he's trying to get them to understand something incredibly significant, that you think you can go your own way on your life, but the calling on your life is actually to go on the other side and find out where Jesus wants you to. That's your calling. How many of you guys have ever heard that phrase calling before? Yeah. So if you've been around church people for any length of time, we love this word, right? We love it. Have you found your calling yet? Right? Like that whole thing. And sometimes like people will be like, you got to go to college. You got to find your calling, right? Anyone ever say that to you? Yeah. Some of you college students know what that's like. And it's like, find your calling. You get your first job. You need to find your calling. Let me let you off the hook and so you can breathe easy. Here is your calling, and every person's calling in this room is to follow Jesus. That's it. Now, you have a choice whether or not to follow that calling. Absolutely. But when you go to work tomorrow, or if you work from home, whatever you do, what is your calling tomorrow?
Follow Jesus.
Yeah, that was an easy one, guys. To follow Jesus, all right? That's your calling. Now, for me, I was in the engineering world for a while and did sales and business development. And so my calling when I was in that corporate world was not to simply bring in multi-million-dollar projects. That was my job. My calling was to follow Jesus in that context. If you go outside of your calling within your job, you do not find Jesus or fulfillment in your job. How many of you guys love your job? It's sad. Look around. Like, this is so sad, right? So sad. So sad, right? Some of y'all work together and you're like, me too. Right? Like, yeah. But guess what? If you follow Jesus in a job that you might not like for this moment, you will still find fulfillment because Jesus will bring life into that job. I know you don't want to hear that because you'd rather just be mad or negative or angry about your job, whatever. But if you inject the reality of following Jesus in who you are at that job, you will find some level of fulfillment. You might switch jobs later. I get that. But man, Jesus changes everything. So you have a calling. Now, this idea of following Jesus was something that every Jewish boy would want to hear. And here's why. One of the greatest accomplishments would have been for a rabbi to come to you as a young child and say, hey, follow me. Follow me. Now, these guys didn't have that. Like, they never had that happen to them for one reason or another. But their reality was they were fishermen. And apparently not very good ones. They couldn't catch anything on the front end. But they were fishermen. But man, here comes Jesus, and he says, to follow me. And so with every vignette here, I want to have a question for you to just sit with for a second. And here's this question. Do I have a desire to follow? Do I have a desire to follow? A lot of us in this room have a desire to lead. We want to go our own way. We want to do what we want to do. Some of y'all are CEOs, some of y'all are running things, whatever. But do you want to follow? Do you really want to follow? That is the first question you have to wrestle with on this Easter Sunday. Do I want to follow? Do I have the desire to actually follow, to surrender, to have a sense of humility with the reality of who Jesus is, to take a step back and breathe for a second, and we'll sing about this later, to be like, whoa, man, the goodness of God. How can I do anything else but have a desire to follow? But you have a choice. So did Peter. Peter had something else going on inside of him. He had this stirring in his soul. There was this moment where Jesus is teaching with his disciples, and they're in this area called Caesarea Philippi. It was formerly known as Paneas, and it was actually an area that this Greek god named Pan was very present, and they believed that he went into this little portal in this cave, and they also believe this portal led to the gates of hell. And so you can actually see that same cave here in Israel today. But here's what ends up happening in this moment. In this moment, Jesus is teaching, and he's like, see, we stand in this area. This god of Pan was interesting. He was the voice. He was known as the voice of the shepherds, the voice of nature. He did a ton of stuff around sexual stuff, and he was kind of like a creepy little god. And he ends up actually dying. And so Jesus is doing this teaching with his disciples, and he's saying, who do you say that I am? Like, who do you say that I am? In the same place where they do child sacrifices and have all these weird festivals and all in honor to this god of Pan. In the same place where they believe that the portal to the gates of hell actually is, Jesus stands there in the midst of all of it and he says, who do you say that I am? It's this huge moment of something stirring. And as we saw with Peter, when he went down to his knees, Peter was this passionate guy. He was someone that would jump to the occasion. You might know the story of walking on water. Peter was there with Jesus and the other disciples stayed in the boat. And they see Jesus in the storm. He's walking on water. He says, Jesus, is it you? And Jesus says, come to me. And Peter gets off the boat and walks on water. Crazy. How many of you guys think you would have had that courage to walk on water? Yeah, there might be a couple of you. We were in Israel, and we were standing in the boat in the Sea of Galilee where it happened. And I looked over the edge of the boat, and I thought to myself, maybe I could. Then I was like, you're an idiot. That would just immediately sink, right? But I was thinking I can't imagine a storm happening. But Peter had this courage to walk on water. And it's whoa, that is crazy because all the other disciples stayed in the boat. So Peter had this passion. When something stirred in Peter, he was responding to it. And he had this passion. So Jesus says to him, who do you say that I am? And it's this huge moment because something was stirring inside of Peter that he responds. And he says this, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. That's a little shot too at the God of Pan because he died. Jesus is the Son of the living God. He says, Jesus replies, blessed are you, Simon, the son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh or blood, but by the Father in heaven. Meaning there's something supernatural happening there in this stirring. I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. And so in this moment, there's something stirring inside of Peter. And you have a choice when something starts to stir. You have a choice. You can begin to explore what that stirring is, or you can ignore it. Peter decides, there's something about this. I might not know all the answers. I might actually have more questions than answers, but there's something stirring in this reality of who Jesus is, what I've seen, what I've experienced around him. And he proclaims, you're the Son of the living God. You're the Messiah. You're the rescuer. You're the Savior. You're the anointed one. There's something here that's so significant to respond to, something that's stirring inside of him. You have a choice with that stirring. God is always, and I mean always, trying to get our attention. Something, when we begin to open ourselves up to the reality of who God is, there's something that will stir in your soul. Some of you guys remember that moment where you felt that so deep inside of you that the only thing you could do is simply respond. You had a little Peter moment maybe, right? Where you fell to your knees, or maybe you started to weep. Or maybe you couldn't just fathom the reality of a God who would forgive and give you so much grace and mercy and show you so much goodness. And maybe that stirring has gotten a little quiet. Or maybe you've ignored it. But see, today is the day where you kind of re-enter and all right, does my life really have direction? Does my life, see what Jesus did with Peter in that moment was you're the rock, right? Meaning when you're this bold, when you declare the reality of who I am, that's a foundation you can build everything on. And when you're like that, that's what I'm going to build my church on that kind of rock, that kind of foundation. It's when you're there in that moment, it's I have direction. I understand what Jesus is doing. He takes his calling and then he has this stirring inside of him. He's let me give you direction to your life. And intentionality to your life. And it changes everything. And so here's the question, the second one that I want you to wrestle with. Is my life moving in a meaningful direction? Is it moving in a meaningful direction? It's moving in a direction, but is it meaningful? Is it purposeful? Will people know how, this is someone who actually, their life is moving in the direction of Jesus? Because it's moving somewhere. Well, in scene number 3 of Peter's life, it's interesting. He just has had this moment when Jesus says, I will call you Peter. And what does that name mean again? the rock, right? So this like huge moment, Peter makes this huge declaration of who he is. And I mean, it's a game changer. And it's like, man, Peter, Jesus is like, let's go, right? Like I'm gonna, like that kind of like heart and that kind of passion, I build my church on that. 2 seconds later, look what happens to Peter. Jesus had just also gotten done saying, listen, I'm gonna die and this time I'm gonna die. And Peter's like, never, Lord. He actually rebukes him and he says, this shall never happen to you. Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, who? That is a rough turnaround, isn't it? Jesus was just like, you're my boy, man. Let's go, let's go. And he's like, get behind me, Satan. Just like that. He says, you're a stumbling block to me. So from a rock to the stumbling block. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but here we go, merely human concerns. And this is a big one. You see, these distractions that end up happening are pretty interesting because we all can have them. I'm guessing if you've tried to do this Jesus thing for any length of time, you've discovered the reality of how distracted you can get, how quickly it can happen, how the things of this world and human concerns can begin to cloud your vision. It makes everything a little bit messier than you thought it would be. You probably thought at one point, man, I was so passionate. I felt this calling, this stirring inside of me. And you felt like, oh, this is going to be easy, man. I'm all in on this Jesus thing. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. It's going to be so good, so good. And then all of a sudden, something else is just getting your attention. And you get so distracted. And some of those things can actually be really good things. But you get distracted. And in the midst of that distraction, it'll lead to distance from Jesus. Once you get distance from Jesus, quite often it leads to denial of who he is. And maybe that's part of your story. And in this moment of distraction, Peter says, you know what? Jesus, I know you think you're going to die, but I'm telling you that's not the way it's going to happen. I would never let that happen. And Jesus says to him, listen, when you're the rock and when you're declaring the realities of who I am, I can build something there. When you try to do things on your own and try to dictate who I am and what I do, you're like Satan. You're my adversary. I mean, take that in for a second. I know, I get it. It's Easter. Let's have like a nice little happy message. But I want to give you a little reality. When we declare the reality of Jesus as the Son of God and as Savior, and we live in light of that, and our focus is on that, and that is our heart, that's what's stirring, that's our calling, that's who we are in line in the realities, like I can build something in you there. I can allow you to see life the way you should, and man, you will be in step with me, and that's a let's go moment. When you decide to do things on your own and only care about what you want and how you want to do it, and then you try to put words in the mouth of God, you are his adversary. And we have a choice to make. Would we rather be in step with the reality of Jesus or his adversary? It's a choice. It's a choice you got to make. It's a choice we have to make every day. And listen, here is, the end of Peter's story is wonderful. But there is just a reality of like this following Jesus thing. Sometimes it's hard. And sometimes we get messed up. And sometimes we make mistakes. And sometimes we need grace and mercy and forgiveness. Some of you guys should be shouting amen. And sometimes we should like really feel the reality of who Jesus is. And sometimes it's just not as easy as we thought. We get distracted. I was watching some people like exercise in our neighborhood, and there's a bunch of guys that were cycling, and there's a bunch of runners, and our neighborhood's like a route for a few different reasons. But I was like, man, what an incredible hobby. It's so good. Like I love working out too, and what a great, but guess what? That can actually become a distraction. A good hobby can become a distraction that creates distance that eventually leads to denial. I love to play golf. Love it. Would do it every day if I could. It could become a distraction that could lead to a distance. Work, for those of you that actually enjoy it, which is like 11% of this room, like work could become a distraction for you. It could be a really good thing for you, but it can become a distraction. People can become a distraction. Sometimes I've heard people be like, man, they loved me so well. And in my head, I'm like, that grouping of people led you away from church, away from faith, so distant. Yeah, they might have been friendly, and they might have elements of love, but they didn't really like love you into the truth. That actually created distance in your life that led to a denial of the realities of Jesus. And so some good things can lead to distance that can eventually lead to a denial. And here's what we begin to see in Peter in this moment. He's trying to just figure out, like, all right, what do I do with all of this? Where is my focus? And here's the third question I just want you to think about. Am I focused on Jesus? It is a simple question. It may not be to the level you want, but is that your desire? Which leads us to this fourth scene in Peter's life. Jesus has just been beaten and whipped, and he's been arrested. He's on his way to being crucified. And it's this scene that picks up, it's very significant with Peter, because Peter had just sat with Jesus and all the other disciples, and Jesus makes this proclamation that, like, hey, there's going to be some denials happening. Judas was one of them, but this denial that Peter, he already tells Peter, listen, you're gonna deny me as well. And we begin to pick up this scene where Peter's in the courtyard looking at Jesus, and says this. Now Peter was sitting in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. You also were there with Jesus of Galilee, she said. But he denied it before them all. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Then he went out to the gateway where another servant girl saw him and said to people there, this fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth. He denies it again with an oath. He's like, I don't know the man. And this oath is like, I promise you, I don't know the man. After a little while, those standing up went to Peter and said, surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away. Then he began to call down curses and swore to them, I don't know the man. And immediately a rooster crowed. Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and he wept bitterly. It's this incredible moment where Peter has this recognition of what's been going on inside of him. Like, he is faced with the reality of what he actually believes versus what he maybe doesn't believe. He may have declared certain things, but in this moment, he realized, when push came to shove, maybe I'm not as strong as I think I am. Maybe I'm not as focused as I think I am. Maybe I'm not as passionate as I think I am. You know, it's interesting. You discover what you believe the most during times of boredom and crisis. See, in crisis, we all know this one. When crisis hits, you run quickly and first to whatever grips your heart the most. Whatever, like, it's like, man, some kind of suffering or pain or something really bad happens. The first place you run to is like kind of discovers like what's going on inside your heart. The other place that we don't ever think about is actually when we're bored. It's in the mundane elements of life, the day-to-day, where we discover what we're actually really passionate about and what we really believe. So in just your kind of ho-hum Tuesday, do you find yourself gripped by the realities of Jesus? Do you wonder what Jesus might be doing that day? Do you find yourself like in times of prayer or even singing or whatever it is, you find your heart oriented towards the reality of wanting to discover more of Jesus? It's in boredom and in crisis where we discover the depth of our faith. And Peter has come very aware. You see, back then when this happened, the courtyards would not have been that big. So the reality is a bloodied Jesus is sitting there seeing and hearing the denial of Peter. He would have been within earshot. And here's what's crazy. Peter, again, known for his courage, his boldness, right, his strength. He gets intimidated by 2 middle school girls to start off on. Now listen, in fairness, middle school girls can be frightening, right? However, he becomes so known for his passion and his boldness, but in this moment, he couldn't even stand up to 2 servant girls. It's in that moment that he discovered, you know what? I'm not quite the person that I've told people that I am. Maybe that's part of your story. And in a moment that you've got to reckon with. And so here is the same question that Peter had. Do I really believe? You're here on Easter for one of probably a couple of reasons, but one of them is you just got invited and you're here. Or maybe you were forced to because it's a family thing and you're here. But most of you guys are here because you said you believed this. And in the same way, you got to wrestle with, do I really believe it? See, the end of Peter's story is awesome because it can be the end of our story as well. Peter has this denial element, and then Jesus dies, and the story goes that he's resurrected. And we go to the end of the book of John, and it's this moment where Peter encounters Jesus again. And it's a super sweet moment, but I want you to see a couple of things here about the redemptive element of this life with Jesus. The redemptive element that every person in this room can tell if they want to. And here's what ends up happening. This might be, we don't know for sure, but this might be the first time Peter actually sees Jesus and experiences him. It says this: Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told him. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out, got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Does this sound familiar? This is the same story as when Peter was originally called. He was catching nothing. And here's what I want you to just take a breath with, because whenever we go into a state of distance or denial from the realities of Jesus, it's so easy to go back to what we're comfortable with. For Peter, it was like, I'm just going to go back to fishing. For you, it might be, I'll just go back to alcohol. I might go back to sex. I might go back to him. I might go back to her. I might go back to work. I might go back to this hobby. I might go back to whatever it is that distracted you, because that's what was comfortable. And so Peter goes back to what was comfortable. It's the same story. And so Jesus is like, hey, you guys catching anything out there? And Peter freaks out, right? It's like, oh my gosh, it's Jesus. And he jumps out of the boat and starts swimming back to him. And then he has this interaction with Jesus. It goes like this. They sit down to eat, and Jesus says to Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He responds, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, then feed my lambs. And again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And then he says, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all the things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. It's this interesting moment here with Peter. I'm going to get to the end of what he tells him the end of his life is going to be. But Jesus is asking him this powerful question of do you love me? And Peter's like, yeah. And he's like, okay, if you do, then guess what? Then you go and show that love. And so even in this moment, what Jesus is saying, if it's real inside of you, it comes out of you as well. And so he's like, feed my sheep. He's having this moment with Jesus. And remember, how many times did Peter deny Jesus? 3. Jesus asked him 3 times, how many times do you love me? It's like this palate cleanser that's happening right there. He's like, do you love me? And then he turns to Peter and he says, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and when you went where you wanted. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. The end of Peter's life is not one of power. It's not one of wealth. It's not one of esteem. It's not one of anything else but the reality of sacrificing, surrendering, focusing his entire life on the truth that Jesus died and rose again. He gave his life up for it. From this point on, was Peter perfect? No. But man, he was passionate about the right thing. His heart was oriented towards the right thing. And in the midst of even times when he struggled and when he did make mistakes or he sinned, whatever you want to call it, he realized and remembered, but Jesus died and rose again. And I get to experience his goodness. I get to experience his mercy. I get to experience life that will overflow. The way in Scripture that they used to say it was, they would anoint people with oil with this it was a descriptor like the presence of God is on you and in you. And they would pour it over their heads. So it would just like overflow on them. And in that they would experience this reality, oh, my life is just dramatically shifted and changed. And the things and the human concerns of this life, I don't fear that anymore because of the reality of who Jesus is and what he's done. And so here's the last question for you today and for me today and for every person that's interacting with the reality of Easter. Do you love me? That is a question you have to answer. Because something happened. Do you love me? Tomorrow you're going to wake up and do whatever you do. The question still remains. Do you love me? So I want you guys to bow your heads and we're going to sing here to close. We're going to sing about the goodness of God. I want you to wrestle with this question because here's what I know. We build our lives around whatever we love. So are you building your life around Jesus or something else? So God, as we God, I just pray. Within this room, I know that there's a reality that you're trying to get our attention. From the person who has denied you their whole life to the person who's followed you passionately. You're in this constant state of trying to get our attention. And today, and in this moment, is no different. So God, I pray that we would have a sensitivity to a stirring that could be happening in our hearts. To begin to explore the reality of what we love. And to wrestle with this question of like, what actually happened? Did he really die and rise again? And is my life shaped around that? Because God, we have a choice to say yes to that or not. And God, for some people in this room, this is a moment to choose. And a significant one. But it is because of your goodness and your mercy and your grace that we have the ability to boldly proclaim and we will sing about the truth of who you are. So God, for me, I choose you. Will you stand and sing this last song with us?